Hur många av er känner till podcasten Serial? Hur många av er har faktiskt lyssnat på Serial? Det är inte så många som jag trodde. Serial är ju apropå det här med realtid, är en amerikansk och numera världens mest lyssnade podcast som handlar om ett olöst mordfall. Och den här podcasten sändes, när den började sändas så började folk höra av sig gällande mordfallet och sådär. Och sen så utformades podcasten och storytellingen i den i realtid utifrån nytillkomna uppgifter och utifrån de uppgifter som journalisterna som jobbade med den här podcasten i och med att de hittade ny information så utvecklades det i realtid. Otroligt spännande. Och det är flera miljoner människor över hela världen som har lyssnat på den här. Och idag så har vi, and now I'll switch over to English because our next speaker is English speaking. Our next speaker is a producer of both Serial and another immensely popular podcast called This American Life. And she's here today to teach us sort of the secret sauce behind real-time storytelling with podcasts. And she will bring up a lot of examples from Serial and maybe from other cases as well. And I'm extremely excited to have Emily Condon here with us today. Welcome up on stage, Emily.
Hello, and thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. As a small way of introducing myself, here's my selfie that I took. As you can maybe see, I'm sort of constitutionally bad at selfies, so you can't see me very well. This was taken last week. I came from New York. This is from a taping of The Late Show with David Letterman, which is a sort of iconic American late night show, which is just wrapping up. So this was the first time I'd ever gotten to do that. So this is, you can see in the background a little bit the stage of his show. So as Paulina mentioned, I'm here to talk to you about Serial Podcast. She mentioned that I'm here to give you a secret sauce, and I'm not sure I'll be able to do that, but we'll see. The thing about Serial, you know, I'm here at a digital conference to talk to you all about this podcast that went sort of incredibly viral all over the world. And the thing that's the most interesting for those of us who made it, we were a team of 4 who made the show, is that we had this huge viral success. And the question, you know, that everybody always wants to know, how do you make something go viral? And the answer is, we're not sure. We're not sure why it happened. And so, you know, I'm going to talk to you about sort of a case study of what happened, but maybe at the end of this, some of you can tell me. And in many ways, I think we sort of broke the narrative of how these things happen. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. Before I get into Serial, I want to talk just for a minute about This American Life, which is the other show that I manage and work on. This American Life has been around for 20 years. It's one of the most successful public radio shows in the States. And it was founded as a documentary show for people who hate documentaries. That was really the whole idea behind it. And so Ira Glass, who's the host and founder of This American Life, still hosts it, founded it 20 years ago. His idea, which was pretty radical at the time in 1995 when it came out, is this sense that, you know, you really want people to keep listening. You never want to turn the radio off. Public radio becomes sort of the fabric of people's lives in a way that they tune out. And he wanted a show where you can't turn it off. Where it's constantly posing riddles that you have to learn the question to, that it's this really driving plot. And the show has become famous for a term that people have created, which is the driveway moment. And that's this concept that, you know, you're in your car, you're in the parking lot of a shopping mall, or you're waiting at the post office, and you can't leave the car because you have to know what happens next. And so every story is really built around a structure like that. And with Serial, with This American Life, I should say first, the format of it is that it's a weekly show, and so anybody here who listens to it, these words will be familiar. Each week we choose a theme, and we bring you a variety of stories on that theme. So the theme this week's show was birds and bees, and it's a variety of stories that are all about how to talk to kids about difficult topics. So one is about talking to kids about race, one is talking to kids about sex. And so that's how the show works. With Serial, we really wanted to try something new, but that really kept that same ethos, that same sort of driving spirit of keeping people from turning it off and keeping people really, really engaged. And so we flipped it. We changed, we sort of inverted the each week we bring you a theme. And with Serial, we decided to take one story and tell it over a series of shows. And what this really did also is kind of harken back to old time radio. When you picture, in the 1930s, families sitting around the radio and having that experience of, Flash Gordon and The Shadow and the sort of classic radio serials, that was really the inspiration. And as it turns out, podcasting was a great form for that. Podcasting, you don't have the constrictions that you have in radio, where you have a broadcast window and have to hit to time. So a podcast can be 8 minutes, it can be 28 minutes, it can be 58 minutes, and the content can really drive the form. And so Sarah Koenig, who is our host and one of the founders of Serial, decided that this was a format that she was interested in. It's funny, again, because podcasting is such a new form, but Sarah, I don't know that she'd ever listened to a podcast. She's never been on Twitter. She's not a digital person. She doesn't spend her time in the way that a lot of the people in this room do. She was really inspired by old novels and what she calls books on tape, which most of the rest of us would call audiobooks. But listening to those sort of long-form storytelling. And so when we started to invent this, one of the biggest questions was, in a world where, 140 characters sort of rules, do people have the attention and wherewithal to stay with long stories? And it turns out they do in very large numbers. This is Serial. We started to come up with this as an idea, and so she started to report the story, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. But like I said, she really wanted to tell this thing over a long period of time. So it ended up being 12 episodes, and the story itself, she had been reporting for a while, and the key of it is that, or the focus of it is 19 years ago. So in 1999, there was a 17-year-old kid in high school in Baltimore, Maryland. His name was Adnan Syed, and he was accused and convicted of murdering his ex-girlfriend after school. It's very much a high school story. A small group of kids who were sort of involved in all of this. And the story went that after school, he strangled her and then drove around with his friend all day smoking weed, and then the friend who he was with ultimately ended up being the state star witness in the case against him. And the case was decided pretty easily. It was not a high-profile case, but when she learned about it, the more she learned about it, the more that it became clear that whatever had happened in the courtroom didn't add up. Didn't make sense, as far as a state's official story. And so the driving question of this, the sort of core central question, was a very simple question, just what happened? But again, she found that, this was a question that people really latched onto. Did he do it? What happened? So she started reporting this story. While she was doing that, and we decided, we had a new show, we had to figure out, how do you make this a product in the world? There's the storytelling, but also how do you make it exist in the world? And that's a lot of what I do. And so here's something we've actually never shown publicly before. These were a series of logos that we sort of toyed with early on in the process. We had a designer named Matt Dorfman who designed our logo, and so these were all rejects. And again, I'll show you. This is what we ended up with. It was inspired actually largely by an old movie poster from the 1940s that we were just looking around and saw the typeface that we really liked. This is the icon logo. So this is actually, even though this is sort of our official logo, this is what most people see on iTunes and when they're interfacing. So these were a series of things we rejected. People initially really loved this one down here because it seemed really clever. The idea of sort of going back into the story, going back in time. That one we looked at and we said, it's really clever. We really like it. But what about the 10th time you see it? What about the 12th time you see it? What about the 50th time you see it? This is a show where every week, you're always, the logo actually on your phone is the main thing that you're interacting with. So these were all things that we sort of modified and came up with this. One of our biggest challenges, and I don't know how many of you here are podcast listeners of any kind? Okay, so at least half the room probably, but in the general population, there were a lot of people who just didn't know what a podcast was. So one of the first things that we had to face and think about is how do we educate people? How do we teach people what's a podcast? And so to do that, we produced a video that I'm going to show you just the first little clip of here. This is the host of This American Life, Ira Glass, who's a very sort of popular public radio figure in the States, with his elderly neighbor.
Okay, ready to go?
I thought you were starting.
All right, I'll start.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I'm Ira Glass.
I'm Mary, Ira's friend.
And I'm here because we're starting a new podcast. It is the first spin-off show from our program. We're very excited. It's called Serial. And we've come to learn that many of you do not know how to get a podcast. And we thought, we have to show you how to get a podcast because it's not very hard. And I thought I asked you to come here today, Mary.
Because I know how to do it.
Not only do you know how to do it, but you do it every week, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Every week. Every week for your show.
I don't need to give away your age, but is it safe to say you are an actual older person?
I'm on the dark side of 85. How's that?
She does indeed podcast every week. That was a true fact. So Ira went on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon to promote Serial, and we played part of this video and just got a huge response. About, how do you get podcasts? What's a podcast? This is so exciting. Later in the video, they actually take out a phone and, they show her pressing play. And so we really learned from this that, one of the sort of most fundamental and most basic things is you need to make sure people understand even what your product is and how to access it. So I think that was sort of a key decision early on that really helped us. Then, of course, it came time to launch the show. And when we did that in October, we had 2 episodes that we launched on the same day. Since it was a serial and the idea is you want people to keep coming back for more, we wanted to give them the experience of being able to skip right on to number 2. But beyond that, we were producing it in real time, which is another thing that was really unusual about this show. In the days of Netflix and programming where you can sort of create everything and then release it and people can binge watch, we just made the decision to not do that with the show. And that was for a bunch of reasons. We're deadline-driven broadcasters. We need the deadlines just in order. That's how we've always worked. And so we need them baked into the production process. But also, I think it ended up being a huge part of the success of the show, insofar as we were reporting in real time. And that was something that was new for people and really enabled people to get excited because it was really this lively thing that was happening. And so Sarah went into this, not knowing what she thought about it. And so you hear her as the series unfolds really wrestle with this. And she goes back and forth about, is this person lying? Do I believe this person? And so the audience is really able to experience that along with her. And I think that was a huge part of the show's success. Also, part of the challenge of making it. Particularly once it started to get really big, it turns out it's really hard to have millions of people watching what you're doing sort of over your shoulder as you're just, killing yourself to make deadlines. But let me give you a little sense of the show. So I'm going to play you a clip. It's literally like the first minute or 2 of the show where she sort of lays out the show's mission.
This is a Global Tel-Link prepaid call from
Adnan Sayed,
an inmate at a Maryland correctional facility.
From This American Life and WBEZ Chicago, it's Serial, one story told week by week. I'm Sarah Koenig. For the last year, I've spent every working day trying to figure out where a high school kid was for an hour after school one day in 1999. Or if you want to get technical about it, and apparently I do, where a high school kid was for 21 minutes after school one day in 1999. This search sometimes feels undignified on my part. I've had to ask about teenagers' sex lives, where, how often, with whom, about notes they passed in class, about their drug habits, their relationships with their parents. And I am not a detective or a private investigator. I'm not even a crime reporter. But yes, every day this year, I've tried to figure out the alibi of a 17-year-old boy.
So that was it. That was the show went out into the world, and that was the mission statement. That's the driving question I was talking about. It lays out right at the very, very beginning of the show, and is really the thing that drives every single episode. Beyond it is this question: what was his alibi? Is the first episode. And then each episode sort of tackles a different angle of the case, but the question remains the whole series. So this went out on the first day that it was released. We had 156,000 downloads. We had been telling ourselves, This American Life, just as a point of reference, about 2.2 million people listen to it every week on terrestrial radio. But on podcast, we had, at that time, we had about 1.1 or 1.2 million people listening every week. So we told ourselves, if we get 300,000 listeners, we are a success. We will be very happy, we'll feel great about that. That was the number that we were shooting for, and on some days, we thought that may have been overshooting quite a ways. So the first day we had 156,000 downloads. We debuted it on This American Life. So we were, giving it out to a platform of people that we knew would be inclined to receive it well. Very quickly, we went viral. It started building sort of from week one. And getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is the sort of case study part that I talked about earlier, and the thing that was so curious to us. The thing that we did is everything wrong, probably. We would have sort of failed the viral handbook, I think, as it exists. We did the bare minimum on social media. And one reason for that, this is a true story. And so because a girl was killed, we had a lot of sort of sensitivity in that area. So we felt like we couldn't be, do a lot of sort of cute or funny or clever things. And so we sort of did the bare minimum. We got it out there. We made sure that it could be, that people could interface with it. But we really always put the content first. Not a lot of orchestrating around it, not a lot of packaging of it. Just made sure that the content was available to people. We turned down a lot of press opportunities. We had some pretty big press outlets who wanted to write about us, but a lot of them were sort of overly orchestrated in a way that would have felt inauthentic to the show. And we were in a production schedule that was just completely punishing. And so we knew that the more that we took time to sort of focus the things that were around the show rather than the show itself, it was going to make the show suffer. So we really focused, you're going to hear me say this a lot here, but we really focused on, the editorial content, kept that editorial mission kind of front and center, and really tried to stay, even as things started to explode around us, really tried to stay focused on what it was that we were making, and really keep that as our primary mission. In terms of press opportunities, it was also really interesting. One of the interviews that we did do, the Wall Street Journal, which is a big paper, did a big above the fold piece, really well reported. That same day, there was a blog called Cupcakes in Cashmere that wrote about the show. It was just a woman writing about her interests, which apparently include cupcakes and cashmere, and writing about it and just saying, "I love this show." And we could see that the traffic from that was like 20 times the Wall Street Journal article, and so that really taught us that this idea that big press is what gets you web traffic, not necessarily true. That was a blog that I think must have really loyal listenership. And so, her readers were really listening to her. And so it was that sort of direct contact that actually gave us much more attention than the Wall Street Journal. We adamantly rejected suggestions to use hashtags. I know that may or may not be popular in this room. But we had a publicist that we were working with who said, I think that every tweet that you have each episode should say, Serial up 5 or Serial 1 up 5 for season 1 or Serial podcast or hashtag Serial TAL. We felt that would be sort of overly contrived for this particular series, that would seem basically like we were trying too hard, and that we were really, sort of encouraging people to share this in a way that we didn't feel was authentic to the show. I don't know if that was the right decision or not, but certainly it seems like it worked. We have a very large social media following. And so I can show, and yet we have here our numbers. So as this is probably a few days outdated, it's still growing pretty fast every day. But as of today, we have a total of 85 million downloads. Serial has been downloaded in every single country in the world except for North Korea and Eritrea. So everywhere else it's been downloaded. And in some countries quite a bit. For quite a while, it was the #1 podcast in England, India, whole countries sort of all over the world. We have listeners in Pakistan, just everywhere. So that's over 12 episodes. So total downloads per episode is more than 7 million people have listened to every single episode of the show. This was, as I said before, just a huge surprise to us. We didn't anticipate this at all. And in fact, the thing that Serial seems to have done is brought podcasting to just kind of a whole new level of recognition just as a medium. And so now podcasting is sort of blowing up in a way. And the video that I showed you earlier with Ira and Mary seems like a lot less necessary than it did even a few months ago when we launched it. This American Lives podcast has grown in the time that since we launched Serial from about 1.1 million to now we're close to 1.5 or 1.6 million. So just in that short span of time. The other thing that happened at the same time, which we were really lucky for and is good for potential podcasters to know, is that when Apple released the iPhone 6 and the new OS, the podcast app is now baked into the phone. It's native to the phone, and so now even if you don't know what a podcast is, you look at your phone, your iPhone, and it's right there. Here you can see, this is by December, the last month of the show, month 3. Here's what I'm talking about this being a word of mouth show. You can see this surprised us, that Facebook, Twitter, which we thought had been a big piece of this, only 1% of our web traffic is coming from Twitter, so that's a relatively small amount. Reddit, which had a huge following around the show, same thing. Then here you can see that press, The Guardian and BuzzFeed, two huge publications, very small amounts. So what's really driving it is Google search, so people just typing in Serial Podcast, 58%, and direct people typing serialpodcast.org right into their URL. And then TAL's This American Life, 4%. So that really was that sort of conversation piece, cupcakes and cashmere I talked about. The other thing that was really important to know is that this was hugely a mobile audience. We designed the website that way. We were always thinking mobile first. And so 72% of people were downloading on mobile. The web traffic is about the same in terms of people accessing it via mobile. And so that was really important to just people's ability to get to it. Just curiosity in this room, Sweden was number 5 internationally in terms of the most downloads. So a lot of people, 1% of the population of Sweden has listened to the Serial podcast. You guys were right after the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. This American Life is actually on the radio in all of those countries. So, and Scandinavia in general, was huge. And so you can see ways in which this went viral. Here we have 7 different podcasts that are in some way about the podcast. So we had several weekly podcasts that sprang up of people just talking about our podcast. So again, that's that conversation piece. Those are all in iTunes. Here is Bert from Sesame Street. This was tweeted by Sesame Street. Bert's so excited for his Thursday morning Serial. It came out on Thursdays. So all of these kind of memes started to come up around the show. Here's CNN Money talking about the serial effect. So there were trend pieces coming out. This is talking about podcast popularity maybe spilling over into other shows, which absolutely happened. Podcasts in general have become sort of huge in that since then. Here, this one to me is the one that I think struck us the most. It's just like something's really happening here. This is a New Yorker cartoon that came out. I don't know if this happens in Sweden, but in the States, especially in big cities, if you're walking down the street, you'll see somebody with a vest on from some organization, and they'll say, "Excuse me, do you have a minute for gay rights, or do you have a minute to save the children?" And what they, want to talk to you about these issues and generally get you to sign a petition and give some money. But in this case, it's, "Excuse me, sir, do you have a minute to talk about the latest episode of Serial?" And to us, this just sort of blew us away, in the joke being that like everybody wanted to talk about it. And again, this is something we didn't anticipate in this way. In New York City, when you'd be taking the subway on Thursday mornings, there was one day when I was on the train and I looked down and like everybody on my row, you could see on their phones, was listening to Serial. And then you would see people who didn't know each other, taking off their headphones and said, "Do you think he did it?" Or what do you think about this? Or what about the Nisha call? Or what about the cell phone logs? And so people really engaging with it and really talking to each other in that way. And that's really what pushed it forward, was just good old-fashioned word of mouth in that sense. And I'll show you one more clip here that's an example of that. This was on Saturday Night Live, which is the most popular late-night sketch comedy show in the States. It's been around for 40 years. So one night we turned on the TV and we saw this.
I'm Sarah Koenig. On December 25th, 1999, a small boy awoke in Baltimore, Maryland. He went down to his living room and found a Nerf N-Strike Mega Magnus blaster. It's a mouthful, I know. That's the toy he wanted. The toy had no tag, no receipt. It was as if it appeared out of thin air. The boy maintained the toy had been brought by magic, by a mysterious man named Chris. But I had to ask myself, could Chris really have done this? And if so, how?
Santa Claus is a slightly different case study, but and so the question here: why did this do this? Why are we on Saturday Night Live? Why are we in the New Yorker? Why did people latch onto this way? And like I said, we don't have the answer to this necessarily. Why does a pop tune become so popular when it does? But the thing that, I can tell you, we spent no money on marketing. I think we maybe took out 3 Facebook boost ads for $75 or something like that. But other than that, we spent no money on marketing. And, we didn't hashtag, we didn't have a social media plan. What we really did was we came up with an idea and a story that we really believed in, and we always put that editorial mission sort of front and center. So we really stayed focused on doing the thing that we, again, there were 4 of us. We didn't know how to build a great social media campaign. We didn't have the marketing dollars to spend. And so what we did was really focused on making the best quality work that we could, and really kept that editorial ethos, really there, and sort of continually said to ourselves, what do we do best? What do we believe in? And that's really what we focused on. And this was the result. Thank you. Am I taking questions?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes, you are. We are taking questions.
Wonderful.
I'm imagining that there are a lot of questions in the audience or on Twitter this time. Do we, Katarina?
Yes, one question on Twitter. You said you turned down media, but did you turn down business opportunities as well?
I'm not sure exactly what sort of business opportunities they're asking about, but I can talk just a little bit about the business of the show. So public radio, by its sort of definition, is it is a business, but it's also public. So a lot of our money comes from listener donations. But we did have spots, ad spots. It's underwriting spots in the beginning of the show. You'll hear, Serial Podcast is brought to you by MailChimp. For those of you who've listened to the show, MailChimp was one of our sponsors. They're an email service. And we had a little produced spot at the beginning of the show saying, this is brought to you by MailChimp. And that spot in and of itself went viral. There were, like hundreds of articles written about MailChimp. There's a girl in it, a Norwegian girl actually in it, who mispronounces, because she couldn't read chimp, she mispronounces it as kimp, so she says MailKimp. And for whatever reason, people latched onto that like crazy. And there's like T-shirts that people wear that say like MailKimp. I've seen
I even
keychains.
heard that MailChimp bought the URL MailKimp.
They did. That's true.
.com, because so many people were searching for it.
It's true. There's a MailKimp Twitter account. There's so that's also part of this, is that people sort of organically, we didn't necessarily have to do this because people sort of organically did it, and it spread out that way too. So the business opportunities, MailChimp, see, I even call it MailChimp, was on board before we started, but then throughout the show, we did have sort of more sponsors come on board. So we did not turn down business opportunities in that sense.
I'm just so surprised by the fact that so much wasn't, that this wasn't your master plan, and that there was so much spontaneous going on behind the scenes. Something that you didn't mention is the fact that you put a lot of content online, or at least some of it, like charts of the mobile traffic and sort of maps over Baltimore and the area where the murder took place, and so it just feels like you still knew that you wanted to include the audience in different ways.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's something I didn't. I was in an earlier version, and then it was too long, so I took it out. But we did do quite a bit of interactive features on the site to try to enhance people's sort of digital experience of the show. So we did put effort into that, where yes, we had maps of cell phone towers where you could roll over and see where, if this cell phone, a lot of the testimony of the case was based on cell phone records. So, you could sort of triangulate and see this cell phone tower and this location, all that sort of thing. And again, that's something in terms of, going toward the future. We're working on season 2 right now, and people are always asking me, what are you going to do to keep this audience? What are you going to do differently? And for the most part, I think we're not going to do much differently. We're going to really try to sort of keep the same ethos and same philosophy going into it. But I think one thing that we'd really like to expand, and one thing that we will put sort of more time and resources into is that, enhancing the sort of extra material around the show, particularly digital material. And we're going to hire somebody who will be full-time to really work on that part of it and enhance and that is, really engaging with the content in sort of a different way in a digital space. And so that's something we're really excited about doing in the future, and sort of continuing to expand the conversation, the editorial conversation, in a digital way.
Any questions in the audience? Just one before we move on.
Well, first of all, I don't want to give anything away to anybody here, but I will say I don't know. After all of that,
do it?
Yes, the question was, did he do? After all of that, I don't know. That's part of the fascinating part of the story.
One interesting aspect is that you are changing people's lives in a way in real time, because I can't remember the English word now, but it's actually, they're going to be a retrial. And I read this morning that they will actually add one of his, another victim that wasn't allowed at the first
another witness. Yes,
another witness.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say this is due to the podcast. We don't know, but there have been some legal developments. Yeah, including last night in his case, where there will be a witness. Yes, that will now be allowed. Actually, the clip that I played from the beginning of the show about the alibi witness, where she will be now allowed to testify. Yeah, having it unfold in real time had all sorts of interesting implications, that some of which we foresaw and many of which we didn't.